All right, I'm going to go ahead and call this assembly retreat to order. So we have four different topics, 3 presentations, and then me babbling on for a little bit. So we have a presentation by Mr. Slipka in finance, then we have a presentation by Mr. Haddon for purchasing, then Mr. Falsey for utilities. Just quickly, I was hoping Ms. Quinn Davidson would be here to do the preface for this, or Ms. Jones, but I'll go ahead and do it myself. So Ms. Jones and Ms. Quinn Davidson and I think a small group of other individuals have worked on doing trainings for the Assembly on a more regular basis on a variety of different topics. And I think Assembly members have sent in topics to the clerk's office on what they want more information on. So right now, this small working group is looking at the last Friday of the month, having this time frame to do those types of trainings and presentations from the different departments. So this is going to be the first of a recurring series. So if you have things that you really want to learn more about and delve into the details, send it to the clerk and we can get it on the schedule for trainings. So we'll go ahead and do introductions, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Slipka.
Austin Quinn Davidson. Suzanne LaGrance.
Cameron Perez-Verdia.
Meg Zalatal.
Christopher Constant.
Forrest Dunbar.
Felix Rivera.
Ron
And
purchasing
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, we have someone on the phone?
yes, Mr. Chairman, this is Crystal Kennedy.
Oh, great.
Alex Slipka, Chief Fiscal Officer.
Ms. Quinn Davidson, I did the sort of introduction of what this is and what we're hoping to keep repeating in the last Friday of the month. I don't know if you want to add anything else onto that.
No, just that if there are things folks want to do, let us know because we're just trying to be helpful.
Okay,
Thanks,
thank you.
Mr. Rivera.
Thank you. So you have a presentation, both electronic and printed. I'm going to walk through this. If you have any questions at all, feel free to interrupt, and hopefully we'll be able to give you the broad overview. Just a little bit about my background. I've actually been involved in one way or another with financial markets for over 40 years. Goes all the way back to it. As an 18-year-old, I was actually a courier in Seattle where I had to actually deliver physical stock certificates and bonds between banks and broker-dealers back when physical delivery happened. It doesn't happen anymore, but that was the start. I went away to college, studied it for 4 years, and been working in the field ever since. So the first page, Chief Fiscal Officer. Basically, we handle all the money. To give you an idea of the scope, the municipality as a whole has $6.5 billion in assets. We have roughly $1.6 billion in debt every year across the government plus all our enterprises. We do about $1.1 billion in revenue and expense. And all of that money, in one way or the other, flows through the finance department. In addition to that, we work together with the administration and the Assembly to try and look out into the future, what are the next 6 years going to hold, what kind of projects are we going to need to be spending money, and we, of course, welcome your input as well in that process. The other small program that we oversee is the 49th State Angel Fund, which is a venture capital fund where we are trying to encourage entrepreneurship through the provision of money in conjunction with local partners. And I'm happy to talk about that if you have questions. Going to the next page, specifically the finance department, our mission, again, generate and collect all the money. I want to really point out that between yourselves and OMB, you figure out how to spend the money. Our job really is to get the money, and that's it. The other thing we are tasked with is maintaining the highest possible bond rating for the municipality. The purpose of this, of course, is if we have $1.6 billion in debt, every point of interest that we can save by being highly rated allows for more money to be spent on worthwhile government goals. We currently have a AAA rating with Standard & Poor's, which is the highest rating possible. And when you hear management and budget talk about the fund balance and the 10 and the 2%, what that refers to is the obligation that the rating agencies would like to see that we have roughly 12% of expenditures set aside unencumbered just in case. And to give you an idea, that number is roughly $50 to $53 million currently. We deliver reports and can obviously provide any information that you might want, and we do our best to safeguard all of those assets as well.
Just really briefly, we've been joined by Mr. Wells.
Next page, so I'm going to walk through some of the various departments that are in finance or divisions. The first one, property appraisal. So their job is to value all of the property in the municipality. I think you've probably already seen a presentation by the assessor, but he is, of course, always going to come and talk to you about what happens. We have, on magnitude, $45 billion worth of property within the municipality, of which $35 billion is taxable, and it is their job to maintain records on all of those pieces of property. I can tell you, just in terms of what's going on in that division, you have probably heard and or seen in the last couple of years we authorized an upgrade to what is called the CAMA system, which is what they use for property assessment, and also is interfaces with our property tax billing system. That runs on an ancient IBM mainframe. They barely exist anymore. And we are in the beginning of a 3-year process to upgrade to a new software system. In the terms of trying to do things intelligently, we're going to buy this software as it is. We are going to install it as it is, learn how it works, and use it. We are not going to modify it. We are not going to customize it. Theoretically, that should avoid some of our issues we saw with SAP. The other thing they are working on, and you'll probably hear about this more, they're going through an exemption review. You're familiar with residential exemptions. If you're a resident, you can get an exemption. Turns out that not everybody who is getting that exemption still lives here. And so in the last year, they went through about 6,000 of those, and turns out that I think it was somewhere around 15% no longer qualified for the residential exception. That resulted in about $1 million worth of additional revenue, which means that, broadly speaking, everybody else's taxes in the next year are going to go down incrementally. We're going to accelerate that. We're working in conjunction with the innovation department. You've probably met Brendan Babb. He's worked on an interface between our property records and the permanent fund dividend records. So if you're not getting a permanent fund dividend, most likely it's because you're not a resident. And so if we see a mismatch there, we're going to send a question out. The other thing we are going to also do proactively is make sure that if people are actually receiving a permanent fund dividend, they may want to apply for the residential exemption and or try to be more proactive about the senior exemption. People often don't realize you hit 65 and you get an additional exemption. So trying to be more proactive with that. Next page is Treasury. Okay, so we figured out how much property. Now we have to calculate the mill rate, send the bills out. What Treasury does is they are functionally accounts receivable. They get all the money in for all the taxes, and then, of course, that gets turned around and spent for government services. They also manage the municipal trust fund. We sold our telephone utility almost 20 years ago, and that is roughly $160 million right now, which generates about $6.2 million in dividends to the municipality that can be used for programs.
Yes, Mr. Constable.
Thank you. So when you look at that number, 6.2 million off of $160 million in assets, that turns out to be roughly 4% or so.
4.2.
Is that a good return? Is that?
Well, that payout is determined, again, I guess we should step this all back, that all the money that we spend is based on your approval. So at one point, that payout was about 5%. Then if the idea is this is treated as an endowment, should exist in perpetuity, 5% is probably too much after accounting for inflation. So it got dropped down to 4%, and then I think last year it got raised back to 4.25%. Unfortunately, after 2018, it might be 4.25% for a while, but the idea is when we can get back to an inflation-adjusted level of where the assets were, we're going to come to you with a recommendation that we might want to be able to raise the payout rate. But for most endowments, somewhere between 4 and 5% as a payout is probably what's expected, and that's distinctly different from what the rate of return is.
So, just a quick note on that then. As we get closer towards the decision out of the RCA, it certainly would be wise for you to be prepared to work with us, to brief us on how the investments could change and how we could be putting some of that money into this in comparison to other opportunities that we have. Should the deal close.
Correct. We are prepared for that. Next page is purchasing. You're going to hear more extensively from Ron about how they do it, but just as a matter of course, this department spends all the money. You authorize it, they spend it, both for general government as well as the utilities, Merrill Field, and the port. Very distinctly, the school district has its own purchasing process. Public finance and investment. We got the money in, we spent some of the money, we have some money left over, what do we do with it? So public finance both invests the money, and it also, to the extent that the voters have authorized and or you have authorized us to incur debt, public finance accesses the capital markets to get that debt at the best possible cost. We, just as a reminder, general obligation bonds, which are the bonds that are approved on the ballot, have to be approved by the voters. Revenue bonds, which are bonds related to the revenue of either solid waste or the port or the utilities, those are approved by you.
Okay, can I ask a question?
Sure, Mr. Number.
If you want to, so the Dyna Center, for example, is funded in part through bed taxes, paying off that debt. How does one structure that? And is that also done by this division? So, for example, just to throw out a wild example, if there were an alcohol tax that paid for a treatment center, how would that work exactly?
So two things. One, so yes, public finance helped work for the roughly, I think it was $95 million that was borrowed to build the convention center, and that those payments are, yes, funded by the bed tax. And so this helped coordinate that. Relative to an alcohol tax, it's kind of a tricky question about is that a revenue that could be tied to a debt, but if you assume that the answer to that is yes, and if you assume that that number is $11 million, so functionally what does that mean? That means that $11 million could support probably somewhere in the neighborhood of at least $100 million worth of a capital project to build a whole bunch of housing, as an example. And
Yeah.
the department would help do that. And
Okay.
that answers the question.
And if you were to go to a vote of the people, why would an alcohol tax be, different than a bed tax?
I think generally, just from an observational basis, are we taxing the tourists or are we taxing ourselves?
Well, I don't mean the
But
politics of it. I just
functionally,
mean
there is
Legally.
no difference.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Number. Ms. Quinn Davidson.
This is just sort of a basic question. Can you explain a little bit more about the revenue bonds and how, I'm just confused how that's different than the bonds you bring to
So, and I'm sure Dean could do this in depth, but the charter says that only the voters can vote to tax themselves. But if you take, for example, the revenue that comes from solid waste. So very recently in the fall of 2018, you voted for a program to rebuild the transfer station at solid waste, and that whole program, the whole plan for the solid waste disposal business is going to be roughly $100 million. So currently, solid waste has zero debt. In order to pay for that, we're going to borrow money. And so what we're going to go to the capital markets and say, you don't get the general taxing authority of the municipality as backing for these bonds. You get what we believe is going to be the revenue stream from this utility, and that will be the source of interest and principal payments. And so it's really that distinction between the functionally, but not realistically, unlimited ability of the municipality to tax versus the probably much more limited revenue stream that can be generated. This is much more highly illustrated in the challenges we're having with the port, in that we are going to have to spend a lot of money, but the port only generates roughly $12 to $14 million in revenue, which can't support anywhere near the amount of money needed to rebuild it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson. Ms. Salato.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To follow up on that last point you made about not having enough money to support the amount needed to borrow, is there a general ratio?
Yes. So generally it's 1.3 revenue to debt service.
Okay.
You need, if you have
Annually?
annually.
Whoa.
So for example,
To pay off what you would owe for that year.
Right.
Not.
so if you borrow $200 million over 20 years, and let's say that makes your debt service $5 million a year, that you would need 1.3 times 5 available as debt service in order to demonstrate to the capital markets that you have the wherewithal to repay that borrowing.
Thank you, Ms. Salato. Mr. Gates.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I was going to add a little bit. I think our CFO explained very well the difference between revenue bonds and others. I think I would add from that experience in the alcohol tax in proposing it 2 years in a row. We did look at having revenue bonds secure construction based on the alcohol tax revenue stream. And then from bond council, we can't really do that. General obligation bonds are used when you're securing financing of the bonds from a tax stream, and that requires voter approval. Revenue bonds secured by the revenue stream utility or enterprise. And the case of the United Central Litigation revenue bonds, because they have a projected revenue stream from rental of space, that's really value, and that's a reliable revenue stream. Similar to the port, they have their tonnage charges and so forth. They raise them a little bit when they need to finance. They need one to issue revenue bonds. And that doesn't require voter approval, it does require assembly approval.
Correct.
That's a huge difference between the two. I think voter approval requirement and assembly approval basis. I hope that's what's
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Go ahead.
And of course, in addition to doing all the debt issuance, public finance also manages the short-term cash, and at any given time, the municipality has somewhere between $300 million and $800 million in short-term investments. I would point out that one of my predecessors, Jeff Sins, 10 years ago, realized that, we never really dipped below 250, 300 million. So I have all of our cash in very short term when we could extend some of the maturities and get a higher rate of return. And so that was put in place 10 years ago. And so when you look at the reports on the cash pool, you'll see there's 3 levels with long-term, medium-term, and almost immediate. And that shift in the period of much higher rates, long-term, has generated over the time period an additional, I want to say, $80 million that, of course, then went to government programs that would not otherwise exist. So a lot of the praise goes to my predecessor for setting that up in place. These days, just for point of reference, with a virtual flat yield curve, doesn't really make that much of a difference, but it did back then.
Well, and I think that actually strikes a note, because yesterday I was listening to a financial report and it said we're not at a flat yield curve, but we're actually inverted right now, and that our short-term returns are equaling higher than long-term, nationally at least. And so how flexible is that structure for you and your team?
It is flexible in that we can look at and shift weighting within there, depending on what seems to make the most sense long term. And in addition to that, public finance also helps supervise. We have a couple of long-term investment funds, the fund for the landfill, and also the fund for the Beluga River gas field, which when the MLP sale hopefully goes through, that will go away. That will go over to Chugach. Just to give you an idea of what's on the docket for them this year, they have already refinanced $40 million worth of AWWU debt. We are about to roll over $40 million worth of port debt that was coming due in, I think, June 30. The hoped-for idea several years ago is that port construction would have happened and that this ultimately would be able to be rolled into long-term debt. We are going to extend the maturity of that debt for 2 years with, again, the hope that port construction will happen and that ultimately when we are able to, hope through a combination of hopefully state grants, federal grants, and or loans, do get this work done, then we would roll that $40 million from the short-term debt into long-term revenue-related debt.
Sure.
On that note, it was a surprise to me to learn that the finance department holds public hearings related to debt issue. And so, can you brief us on how that works, why that happens, kind of a little bit about this, not any specific case, but that process?
How about if I send you some information afterwards as much so I can make sure that it's accurate?
Yeah, so just so everyone knows that there are separate public hearings that happen outside of the scope of our work that I'd never heard of, and then someone sent me a note, this public hearing, and I'm like, oh, good to know. So thank you, that's fine.
Okay. And then the final piece is that we have roughly $191 million with the short-term debt with MLP that is going to expire in November. We are going to extend that to September of next year, and hopefully when the sale goes through, that will be paid off completely. Finally, the controller's division. So we've got all this money. Somebody has to count it. That's what the controllers do. They do all the accounting functions as is listed there, and then they are also responsible for the compilation and the delivery of the annual financial report, which we hope to be giving to you in mid-July. And as an observation, SAP really hindered this process. We only delivered the 2017 financial to you in January of this year, which was probably 6 months late easily. We are on track to deliver the 2018 financials within the normal time frame, and SAP was really very helpful in that regard.
We appreciate it.
As do we. Happy to answer any questions.
Yes, Mr. Wells.
I had a couple. Sorry, I came late and then I jumped out briefly, but particularly for some of the new members. So when we sell bonds, and we all know bonds because we vote on it, but then you have the TAMs,
right?
You talked about, and then we also, and then there's a difference. Did you talk about excise taxes versus sales taxes? Because we did like the tax on fuel didn't have to go to a vote. People think of it as a sales tax, but it's something different. But anyway, so for revenue, but we got the TAMs, we got the key bank loans. as quick short-term things, and then I forget what the cost.
Certificates of participation.
So yeah, so there's a whole variety of things that we can take a lot of revenue in from that are essentially loans. You and I would think they're loans, but they're not bonds that go to a vote. Did you go through those?
So I didn't go through those specifically, but I'll talk about those at a higher level. And again, we don't do anything unless the assembly approves it. So from a cash flow standpoint, the low point in cash is generally right about now. We're going to get our first tranche of property tax payments in 2 weeks. But March, April, May, we still have bills to pay. So we have, for the past several years, generally issued what are called tax anticipation notes. They are less than a year in maturity, and they, but they functionally are, in the past, it has been beneficial in that we didn't have to draw down the cash pool and sell higher yielding securities in order to fund government. We could issue these shorter term securities that had a lower yield and actually, just in the whole process, actually make a little bit of money. These days, as Chris said, yields are fairly flat, if not, there's a slight bit of differential. So it's functionally a break-even proposition for us, but it helps us to avoid the possible negative impact of having to hit some of those longer-term investments. So that's a tax anticipation note. In terms of the difference between excise taxes, motor fuel taxes, as opposed to, I would have to do some more research on those to give you a better answer on how those are different.
Well, I think the difference is they're on a per gallon basis per bulk. It's not percent of sale. So your percent of the sale has to go to a vote, but if you just say every time you go buy a loaf of bread, you pay 50 cents, that's an excise tax. It doesn't have to go to a vote. Right?
I don't know for certain, but I will read it. Oh, Chris is saying that he could. I will get some information.
Yeah, I think it also, if I might, has to do with at what point in the supply chain the taxation occurs, like wholesale versus retail. I'm not sure.
I will get some details.
So you were going to think key banks are different.
So KeyBank is actually just a provider, and what that goes to is we have for several years, you heard me discuss short-term debt versus long-term debt. And again, this gets back to the period of time up until now where there was a real difference between borrowing for the short term and borrowing for the long term. And that we have a commercial relationship with KeyBank where they have provided a number of facilities for us to borrow money at a shorter time frame at a lower rate, thus lowering our costs. So we have utilized them for the financing of SAP. We are utilizing them for the AWWU loans, and I'm pretty sure we're also utilizing them for the rollover of the port debt, which was originally issued by Citibank, but which they decided they didn't want to continue the relationship.
And I just trying to remember, so because we've had stuff come to us on the key bank, is there like, we raise the minimum or maximum amount that we can have there or something?
We
what
have
are the parameters on that, the key bank?
the parameters are driven on a commercial basis by them in terms of how much we can have outstanding. I can find out what that number is. I want to say I believe it was something like $100 million, but I will find out for sure.
So serious money. I mean, SAP was being financed through that. So.
And one additional clarifying question. So is the KeyBank loan, is that different than the master loan program, or is that the same thing?
We're talking about the same thing.
Okay, so then I think the master loan program is actually something like $500 million.
Could be. I will
Yeah.
find out.
Yes, Mr. Franks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to follow up on that, we had questions from constituents. Why didn't the money for SAP? Why didn't voters, need to approve that as some kind of bond? Why were we able to secure so much money, or how to finance that versus other projects that require voter approval?
Because we did not, KeyBank did not need us to pledge the full faith of the government for those payments. Those payments are very much linked, for lack of a better word. It is almost like they are lease payments on what we bought. Of granted, a lot of what we bought is intangible, but KeyBank was willing to structure that facility so that we could do it that way.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prince. Any further questions for Mr. Slipper?
Do we have any projected use of the certificates of participation that you're thinking of over the next several months?
So when you talk about certificates of participation, what are you specific? Are you talking about the prepayment we made to police and fire?
No, I'm not talking about actual use of funds that are already secured under certificates of participation. I'm talking about, are you aware of any upcoming new issuances of certificates of participation proposed for projects in the near term? I've been trying to track the number of buildings we have, the value of buildings of land we have of a building, so to understand how much of our land base we're actually using, or a building base we're using for that vehicle. So I'm just wondering, I'd love to be briefed as soon as we can, and that tool is contemplated.
I am not aware of any new additional use at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Prince. Sure. Sure. Mrs. Prince, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, to follow up on what Mr. Constant said, as I recall, certificates of participation were issued to fund the ML&P transaction, because that kind of debt could be paid back with the revenue from the sale.
Yep.
Is that, do you know offhand how much of that, what percentage of money has been spent? And I'm assuming that's still the plan, to pay it all back once the transaction goes through?
That is the plan. That you authorized a total amount of, I believe, $7.1 million through the end of 2018. We had spent roughly $1.1 million. We had actually gone out into the marketplace and borrowed half of it, $3.8 million. So we had a couple million sitting around. Now we are spending money quickly. The attorney's fees would be several $1 million. Transaction fees are several $1 million. There was money that the municipalities spent to accelerate the completion of this year's CAFR so that we could meet the obligation under the purchase agreement. And we anticipate that by the time this is all said and done, we will have probably spent all of that $7 million.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Prince. Mr. Wells.
So assessments. I think complaints out of Susanna got, but there were some jumps like in Hillside and Girdwood that were just dramatic. And, 30% increase in assessment. And so everybody expects taxes to go on their assessments and grumble about it. But that was like a real eye opener. So I mean, I kind of have an idea of how that happened. They looked at this closer and they said, "Well, these are better quality," and they go into the computer programs. That's what it come out at. But it seems people need a warning or something, or really clear rationale. Why did this go up? And what they get is fairly vague. Well, we took a look and the quality of your input seems higher than we thought it was. Nothing has changed in 20 years. You know, that's the other side. You know, why is this so? I mean, have you looked at just the PR side? I mean, I think you could tell us, I guess, Jack has, you know, for the parameters, what are your requirements for assessing? But there should be some way to acknowledge that it's a huge jump. We need to do some outreach.
I guess what I would say is Jack Gadamus, who's the assessor, would welcome the opportunity to spend a lot of time talking about what they do and how they do it, and welcome the input about it. If there was a way where we saw something dramatic change going to happen, that maybe there is a better way to communicate that.
You know, people miss it. You know, they get their green card and go probably the same as always, and they get their bill and they go, "Whoa, they missed the repeal date." Anyway, it's something to consider. PR.
Thank you, Mr. Wells. Yes, Mr. Gaines.
Thanks. I have little experience in that area from my years at the Department of Law and doing some property assessment administrative appeals to court. And I assume we're talking mostly of residential properties values. And residential properties are basically valued on a comparative sales basis. So then those are constantly compiled as sales if residential properties occur through the year. And it's basically, I'm just saying, it's based on the real estate market sales and how they fluctuate. The hillside properties are selling at high. Everyone else's property, when they assess the value January 1, is going to increase. And if the sales are throughout the year for comparable property are going low, then you're going to see assessments drop for that area. And it's not just area, it's the size of the house. A 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom is going to be compared to another 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom, for example. So I think, though, that what you're saying is they should probably have a better description of how that works, maybe on the property appraisal webpage for the public to see.
Yeah, I got the big picture, but when one street, one neighborhood, and coincidentally is where I used to live, so everyone there knew me and called me, but there's jumped 10 or 15%. No one else in these very similar lots adjacent. So it's like, okay, well, be prepared to explain that because you're going to hear about it. Right.
And it might actually argue for, Mr. Chair, the idea of you set a threshold. If there's an increase of X percentage, then there's some special attention granted to those residences. Because this year we got a nice little note card that said, if the state doesn't do their job, you're all going to pay the piper. So there's room for communication.
The other obvious solution is mandatory sales reporting, so that we would have that data on a mandatory basis. I grew up in Washington, and it was the law down there. So.
That was proposed in the past.
State of Washington, yes.
Yeah.
State level here.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Thank you, Mr. Whittleton. So, Ms. Kennedy, do you have any questions?
No, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. All right, I don't see any further questions. Thank you so much, Mr. Flipka. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on. So this next portion should be relatively short. So one of the things that was put in a parking lot the last time that we met, and Lori Wolf was guiding us in our goals discussion, was the idea of, and I don't know if I necessarily agree with the framework she put, but the, what did you say, knights sort of jumping in to save the day kind of ordinances. And I know particularly Mr. Constant and I think other members have an interest in collaborating on these types of ordinances. And so I just wanted to use this time that we have now to talk about that and to talk about how we want to collaborate on those ordinances that may not fit in the goal, in the big goals that we are going to be working on and putting forward, but they might be particular issues that our constituents are really interested in. And I'm sorry, I don't have more specifics because I don't have a list of those types of things, but how could we collaborate on those? And I guess Mr. Constant and Mr. Dunbar.
I have a specific one that Ms. Salentil and I are dealing with right now that we should see introduced at noon. And that is, after having asked the administration what their plan was for the expiration of the extended cold weather sheltering system in May, they told me, oh no, it's the end of the summer. Well, in fact, it expires at the end of this month. And we have to get that on the table, or we're going to throw out 60 women from the Hope Center onto the streets. And so, it's not to save the day, it's to do the basic business that should have probably been done. But that's coming at the last minute. We're going to debate it as soon as we can.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Dunbar.
This is the part of class I usually use to remind the teacher that we had a homework assignment. Back when I was in high school and much loathed by my classmates. Is that when you wanted to discuss that stuff, or because we did send them lists of here are the things we want to do?
Yeah, so I think they're two separate tracks. I think there's sort of the track that I'm really gonna have Lori sort of spearhead, and her and I are gonna spearhead, which is the goals. And I think most everyone sent in those goals, and Lori actually I think is working on compiling those and sending them back to us so that we can all look and digest sort of as a body whether we think our big goals are. But then there's also I don't want to call them sort of smaller pieces of legislation or smaller goals, but sort of the little things that our constituents bring up, and we want to try to resolve these issues. Or maybe some personal issue that we campaigned on, and we want to work on this issue. And so the idea of, I want to collaborate on these things, how can we do that as a body so that when, and I think there was actually a very concrete thing between Mr. Constant and Ms. LaFrance on both of them introducing something that was basically the same subject. So how can we collaborate so that those types of things don't happen?
Yeah, so you're saying that this moment here is a chance for us to kind of throw this up. Because, like, for example, Mr. Welt and I have been collaborating on a bear resistant container ordinance that is working with the administration. We're introducing on Tuesday. So I'm not sure how, I can't remember how that happened exactly, but we ended up collaborating. But it's true that it's hard to kind of scout out who's working on what. So you're saying right now just to throw stuff out and just see if anybody else is working on it?
If folks are comfortable doing that, what I wanted to see is how we wanted to do that process. I don't know if today would be the day where we throw all our stuff out there. Mr. Constant.
Just when Ms. Quinn-Davidson walked in, and I missed the brief introduction, the idea of every Friday, last Friday of the month work session that's scheduled in which we get to come together and free-form riff on, hey, these are the things that I need to get done or I need help with. That is the perfect venue, if it's legal, for us to do that, to once a month just check in and say, these are my priorities, time-wise, here's mine and how, who wants to join me? And so I think if we're instituting a first or last Friday event, then we should use that tool. That would be my suggestion.
Okay. All right. So,
Mr. Chairman?
Oh, sure. Yes, Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you. I want to agree with Mr. Constant on that one because I felt like things have been so structured and kind of prescriptive that it's been hard to find a way to just really have that free-flow conversation about what's up and what kinds of things are coming up in your community. So if we would put that time at the end of the month for something like that where we could just kind of throw stuff out there and not be in violation of any kind of Open Meetings Act, that would be really great and very helpful, I know, from my perspective. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Mr. Wells.
So to the two former school board members, what did the school board do?
Go ahead, Crystal. You can go first.
We had meetings, executive committee meetings, if you will, before every regular board meeting. Excuse me. And we would often just have the opportunity to bring something up, at least to the superintendent, to say, hey, this is what we're hearing, or this is what we think is going on. So it wasn't necessarily, it wasn't necessarily just a free-for-all, but it was at least a meeting that was noticed. And even the executive, we called them executive committee meetings, but they were open unless we went into any kind of executive session. But anyway, it was the time right before every single one of our school board meetings. So we always had that kind of give and take, free flow, if you will, at every meeting.
Yeah, two things. And we were on the school board at different times, and so I think it changed depending on the administration, depending on who's in the school board. I think it changed. When I was on the school board, we definitely, at the beginning of each year, did what I mentioned in a previous meeting, where we put all of our ideas on the table and looked at them and began to sort of, as a group, prioritize them and develop sort of, these are the 10 priorities we're going to work on this next year, in addition to what, other things came up and emerged and that sort of thing. So we certainly created priorities. We also had a very clear strategic plan and set goals with that plan and set metrics aligned with those goals. And so that was another driving sort of force, and then tried to sort of align all of our actions to that in some way, so that there was a sort of a thoughtful alignment, including the budget in terms of spending and how are we sort of thinking about spending in alignment to our goals. And then the last thing I would say is, we for a number of years set work sessions prior to every meeting, and they weren't work sessions that were there were agendas, but it was one long work session that was a set time, and then that was the opportunity to sort of bring topics to the table and discuss them and work on them. And so to the degree we would notice, here are the topics we're going to discuss, but other topics would emerge during that period of time, and it was an opportunity to work through all of those kinds of things before the formal meeting. So.
And Mr. Chairman?
Oh, sure, Ms. Kennedy.
Mr. Chairman, and I would just say yes, when I was on the school board, we also had the work sessions or even the beginning of the year kind of strategic planning meetings as well. I was just speaking specifically to those opportunities to just bring up the, hey, what's the latest? What do we need to look at? How do we deal with this? Kinds of opportunities that were available before every meeting. Thank you.
Go ahead.
So I just maybe put to Dean and Barbara. I mean, what would if we had a work session or once a month, what would the agenda look like? I mean, how much do we all have to say, here's the ideas we'll be talking about, or is it just assembly brainstorming and ideas sharing? I mean, what does the public need to know?
Through the chair, I think one of the issues is the subject of the work session. I think the public needs to know what the subject is. Having an untitled work session could be problematic. If it was focused merely on the agenda, I think you could probably manage that. This work session, for example, it is a training work session, but the public notice includes the 4 topics, specifically the 4 topics that you're discussing today. With your committee meetings, we believe that the broad title of the committee, for example, the Enterprise and Utility Oversight Committee, is sufficiently broad to cover any subtopics within that. But I do think that you could have some danger with a broad topic that doesn't have a specific subject. And Dean can probably cite the code for you.
So I'll go Mr. Constant, then Ms. Benedict.
I'm actually just elevating.
Oh, okay.
I think then that argues for us to do this work in the Rules Committee, which is a committee, and that can have an intended kind of goal of monthly priority setting, right? And the Rules Committee is to set up the kind of rules of order of how we take care of our business. And so if the committee process is more aligned with staying in compliance, then that would be the proper convening.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Constant. You stole my thunder, actually. Is the Rules Committee, the description of it, sufficient enough for us to be able to do this type of thing in the Rules Committee? Or do we need a finagle?
Through the chair, I think it could be. I don't have the mission of the Rules Committee, but I think if you look at some of your committee meetings, it has the purpose and mission. Oh, Desiree has it right here in front of us. It says, it serves as a standing assembly committee to study and develop the best procedural methods for handling a wide variety of matters that come before the assembly, and to accept referrals and recommendations. So I think we could probably use that to cover this. So yes, Mr. Chair.
Great. So then what we can do, unless there's an objection, we can probably continue with these last Fridays, and then on top of these last Fridays, we also have a Rules Committee meeting. So these would go back to back. I think that's something that we can do. All right. Well, then we'll get that scheduled starting in June. Okay. So unless anyone has any comments, we'll just keep going. Yeah, Mr. Prisverdia.
Just in terms of the timing of the Rules Committee in relationship to meetings, that would be my only comment, is that the value of having it close to meetings as a way to sort of work through what potentially is coming at that meeting, or whether it's a discussion on more long term. So that's just a question for you, and the timing of it. I'll leave it at that.
Just comments on that briefly. So we usually have work sessions the Friday before on topics for that meeting if there's something that we think we need to discuss more. Could you sort of detail a little bit more of the purpose outside of talking specifically for that meeting, what the rules committee would be before?
Right. So would the rules committee be, for instance, on a Friday prior to the Tuesday assembly meeting, specifically to sort of work through what's going to happen at that assembly meeting, or is it a longer term sort of conversation?
I think it's the second meeting.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's just talk strategically long term.
Yeah.
That's the sort of thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's what I wanted to know.
And I'm sorry, did you?
I relinquish.
Okay. All right. Mr. Constant.
I would just add that if and once the process becomes a regular, standing, active, monthly kind of engagement, that the effect will be that we will kind of coordinate around ideas that are important at the time and the long term. It's just once it becomes, I believe, incorporated as a standard, then it will have that function really well.
Well, can I just add one more thing? Because some of this may just be the function of the assembly, how it works, the rules go under it. It may just be impossible to sort of get beyond this. But as a new person coming in, the way that and I don't think this is anybody's intention, the way that it feels is there's lots of isolated work going on. And there's absolutely no communication about it. And so I show up for a committee meeting and, me and her, or him and me are working on this thing, and it's, that sort of thing. I'm like, wow, I would love to know about that, or I would like to be involved in that, but I have no idea it's happening, or work can go on for weeks, but nobody else knows it's going on, and so I feel like there's got to be a way within our rules, for that a lot of that isolated work to not happen in that way, unless it needs to be. Right? Unless there's a reason for that to be isolated, that's great. But if it's just because of the function of how we're set up, so that's what I'm trying to figure out. If this meeting helps with that,
Yep.
in that let's bring to the table kind of the isolated work that's happening, and so other people could have input into it or get involved in it if it's necessary.
And I would say that yes, this would help with it because we wouldn't be constrained by Open Meetings Act violations, which is the main reason why it feels like everything's so isolated.
With some red flags, of course, having to be very careful with how work proceeds from those moments, because you still have to keep under the subject.
Sure. Yeah. Sure.
Through the chair, Mr. Perez-Padilla, I think that's a good comment because it means you're following the Open Meetings Act. So, and I think you all know the danger is you've got two people working on something. 3 is fine, but 4 is a violation. And if it's even a casual conversation or an email, it's a violation. So I'm actually glad to hear that. But I do think that we have a solution to that, and the chair has actually been working with me because he thinks that we can offer you better service if we know that information as well. So in any event, I think this is going to really exponentially help the assembly because you're going to find out what each other is working on without violating the Open Meetings Act. And then I think we can better support you.
Thank you, Mr. Perez-Padilla.
So I just want to use the example of HIPAA and FERPA. These were intended to for safety and for privacy and for all of these really important reasons. They weren't created to make work more difficult. They weren't created to create isolation or make things really inefficient, but they often do. And so that's I think our challenge is that respecting the intent of that law in terms of being transparent and making sure that we are following it. But it's not intended, from my perspective, to create really inefficient work. And so if we can do both of those things, is follow the law, but also think about how to be more collaborative and use our time and our energy more efficiently, I think that would be the goal.
Thank you, Mr. Perez-Padilla. Okay, I think we are ready to move on.
Years in the purchasing field. I was lucky enough to be assigned at J-Bear twice, and then I retired from J-Bear in 1994 after 24 years. Then I've spent the remainder of time doing different things within the city. I worked for Alaska Native Tribal Health for about 5 years as their director. I worked at C.H. Hill as their Pacific Rim Contracts Manager for about 5 years, and I've been at the city since 2011 as the director. So with that kind of background, I'm just going to jump into the presentation. You'll see on page 2 kind of what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to try and not read the slides to you, but try to talk to the things that are here. So it's always important to understand who we support. And as Alex said earlier, we are a centralized buying activity. We do support the entire municipality, whether it be general government, which is our police, fire, roads, Anchorage Health Department, whoever we are in the city, we support all of those activities. And I think it's also important that we get some terminology because in every endeavor we talk about things that we think everybody knows and use acronyms, and in many times we don't. So I wanted to go through some of the terminology that you're going to see in various documents from the Assembly. First one is a request for quote. Sometimes it's referred to as an RFQ, and those are for requirements within the city that are what we refer to as informal acquisitions, those buys under $50,000. Relatively simple buys. We can either, per the code, we can either do verbal solicitations or we can put them in writing on our website. We generally put them in writing on our website. What you'll see majority of the time on the Assembly are invitation to bids or an ITB. Those are solicitations that are formal solicitations over $50,000. And on an ITB, low price wins if the contractor or vendor is responsive and responsible. And in terms of what does responsive mean, it's really an administrative requirement. Did he follow all the instructions for the bid? Did he deliver it on time? Did he sign it? Did he provide different documents that were required within the bid? If he does all those things, he is a responsive bidder. If he does not do those things, he is non-responsive and is thrown out. I have, per the code, I have no choice. If a vendor is late for whatever reason, he is late, his bid is not considered. If he fails to sign his bid, which we have had happen, he is non-responsive, I cannot accept the bid. Those are written in code, in stone. I have no choice. Yes, ma'am.
Actually, really quickly, I just wanted to note for the record, we've been joined by Mr. Peterson. He got here about 10 minutes ago. Mr. Franks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On that note about the code, I mean, do you think that we need to take a look at it? Because when I heard you say low bid wins, I mean, a few warning flags went off with that. I mean, is that something we need to take a look at, or do you think it's functioning to deliver the best value to the municipality as we can?
Let me continue on,
Okay.
and we'll talk about best value in the RSC.
Okay, thanks.
Because what we do with invitation to bids, the code, and I'll jump ahead a little bit, what the code tells us is you should use an invitation to bid because that's a competitive process, and if you're not going to use an invitation to bid, you can use a request for proposal, but I'll talk about it in just a minute.
Thank you.
So, and there are times when bids will come in that they look very low. And what we do as a matter of process is we have our bidders verify that their bid is in fact accurate before we come to you or before we award here. And we have had bidders as a result of that look and go, oops, we made a mistake, maybe withdraw our bid. And we allow them to do that. So we don't get abnormally low bids.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
But in terms of determining whether we can accept a bid or not, there's two elements there, responsive and responsible. And a responsible bidder is defined in AMC 720.03. And I'm paraphrasing here, but it really means do they have the technical financial capacity? Do they have positive past performance? Are they an honest bidder, and do they have integrity? And it leaves that within my discretion to determine whether they are a responsible bidder. If a bidder is responsive and responsible and low price, then they win the bid. Any questions on the invitation bid?
Sure. Ms. Salto.
This is just a comment. As we're considering the assembly procedures, and we had talked about perhaps a little like fact sheet defining these terms in there, because in our consent agenda in particular, there's a lot of that language. It was one of the first things that peaked for me, like, oh wait, what do these terms mean? So just a comment to put it on our radar now. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Whittle.
So, well, this is a big discussion, I guess, to what Suzanne was talking about. So, you know, I just kind of background, you know, we hear LRSA contractors. Okay, I got the same guy we had last year, we hated him. We're stuck with him because he had the low bid. Well, where does past performance come in?
It's basically a subjective judgment on my part. If a department has documented poor past performance, I can use that in declaring a contractor non-responsible. I'm doing that currently with a custodial bid that's out. So we have had the 2 low bidders. We have a history of non-performance with them. So I'm declaring them non-responsible, and we're going to the 3rd low bidder.
So what would that process look like then? If you're someone who lives in alerts in the hillside, contractor's driving you crazy, you go to Maury.
They would go to Maury to document that. Maury would come to us and say, here's my documentation, here's where they have not performed in accordance with the contract. And then I would look at that when the next low bids come in and say, is that really adequate to declare the contractor non-responsible?
Does it happen often?
It happens sometimes. I say it's happening now in custodial district.
Thank you, Mr. Whittleton. Mr. Constant, then Mr. Miller.
So, Barbara, indeed, just to verge into the area of talking about upcoming potential legislation that is being worked on, we're in open session and it's on the topic on the agenda. Ms. Quinn Davidson and I are working on a draft ordinance addressing responsible contracting, which would add some more criterion on which the administration,
Me.
you.
Huh. I thought I was too.
I
Maybe not
haven't
with
seen
you.
your name on it yet.
Maybe not with you.
Exhibit A.
That would add
But I
some
would.
requirements and some measurable benchmarks. We're working with Justin and
Oh, on that, okay, I'm
yeah,
sorry,
that
yes.
would, and with the legal department, they've had several whacks back at the project and it's moving. And so we are in fact contemplating changes to the responsible side of the question of the awards of contracts through the municipality. So stay tuned, that's coming up.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Dunbar.
I'm just curious, what's the rehabilitation process of that? If someone is found to be non-responsible, how do they get back into good graces?
Perform on their future contracts.
But how would they, if you won't award them contracts, how would they ever do
If
that?
they have existing contracts, and that's the case in this example I'm talking about on custodial.
Okay.
We would encourage them to perform on those contracts.
If someone doesn't have an ongoing contract, you just declare them non-responsible. And I actually think it's great that you do that. But how in the future would they rehabilitate themselves?
They would have to come back and show me where they have done similar contracts and have performed in a responsible manner through different agencies.
Has that ever happened?
Yes, it has.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Whittleton and Ms. LaFrance.
So following up on that, so, you know, Bill's custodial does a bad job, and you say, look, I'm not going to let you bid anymore. You blew that one. And then he says, well, I'm not bidding on this one. It's Annie's custodial. That's my wife. It's still us. But do you do it by the person? Do you have the latitude to do that? Or is there else a different business that's a brand new?
We try and look at who are the owners and their performance. We try and look at it in a holistic manner. Sometimes they will change names, but if it's the same, and I'll just use words, the same character, just a different name, we're going to look at that and say, sorry, guys.
Okay, good, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Whittleton. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So some of these ITBs are really complex, and I think the example that forever looms is SAP, and because we've had conversations, ongoing conversations about what could we do differently, and to what Mr. Constant's working on, I was approaching it from, how can we, are there any changes that can be made to how the, proposal was released, or was it about the contract that could have circumvented some of the problems with SAP? Are there code changes, process changes? What exactly would increase the likelihood of something like that not happening again? So when you do have a complex ITV, I'm assuming then you work with folks on staff, or in some cases when it's really complex, like with IT, probably you would need to have a consultant just even to write, the I want to say RFP, but ITV for that. Is that?
Yes, ma'am. We work very closely with the departments in the preparation of the specifications. In fact, the departments will prepare the specs. We will review those to make sure that they haven't tried to tailor those to a specific company. And then we'll also look at the evaluation criteria. In the example of SAP, that was not an invitation to bid. That was a request for proposal. That's a perfect segue for me to talk about an RFP. That is another mechanism of which we acquire formal solicitations. Those things above $50,000, we can use an invitation to bid or an RFP, depending upon the circumstances.
Before you get into the details too much, I do have one more question, so apologies. Ms. Altel.
Actually, this is perfect timing because I've seen a situation where there was a request for an RFI, so request for information prior to an RFP, and are those generated then from you or from the actual departments? Do you guys work together?
We work. Short answer is we work together.
For the request for information to
Yes,
make
ma'am.
sure it would have everything you needed then to use that information to create a successful RFP or maybe an invitation to bid depending on which route's taken. Okay. And one quick other follow-up if I had. When someone isn't being responsive or responsible in your judgment, do they get a chance to kind of, it lies in your sole discretion, but are there any appellate rights there? Can they complain about it in
Yes,
some way?
yes, ma'am, they can. They can do what's called an appeal.
Okay.
Another word, appeal and protest are used simultaneously, but the code does not talk about protest, it talks about appeal.
Okay.
And I'll talk about that later on when we get down there. About what
Thank you.
appeal is.
Thank you.
Okay, going on, the request for proposal, the difference between that and an invitation to bid is very simply on an RFP, you use factors in addition to price to select the vendor. Give you an example. For instance, on an invitation to bid, it's generally a homogeneous item that's pretty easy for a bidder to bid on. Classic, I like to use a classic example. If I'm going to buy cases of milk, that's probably going to be done on an invitation to bid. But if I'm going to go out and acquire brain surgery, I don't want the low-price surgeon working on my head. I want to use factors other than price and in addition to price. And in fact, when you look at RFPs, the Alaska statute does not allow me to use price in selecting a architect and engineer. In fact, I have to go on a best qualified basis. I make the selection, or we make who is the highest ranked proposer. Then we will go to negotiations with them, and if we can negotiate a fair and reasonable price, then we'll award to the architect and engineer. If we can't, we are allowed to move to the second offerer. Next terminology I'd like to talk about is difference between a purchase order and a contract in SAP. A purchase order can be one of two things. It can be a payment mechanism backed up by a written document, i.e. a contract in our normal terminology, or it can be an ordering instrument itself. And the way to differentiate a purchase order from a contract is the numbering system. A purchase order is going to have the year 2019 followed by 6 numerical digits. Or when we move to 2020, it will be 2020 followed by that. A contract in SAP, it's an unfunded document of which you write purchase orders against. Sometimes it's referred to as a term contract. Sometimes it's referred to as a master contract. And you can differentiate those. Those will start with a 40, first 2 digits are 44. And And in your assembly memorandums that you see, it will be referred to normally as a non-encumbering contract, because we set the terms, conditions, and pricing, of which then, when you have a requirement, you would issue a purchase order against that will define the pricing for that particular work. What governs how the purchasing office does business? It's Title VII of the Municipal Code. And just in terms of when is competition required, the code right now defines competition required when a single requirement is over $5,000. We use RFQs, the request for quotes, for informal acquisitions between $5,000 and $50,000. We will use a formal invitation to bid or an RFP when it's greater than $50,000. Those are formal acquisitions. You will see me coming to you asking for approval on non-competitive requirements, sole source requirements, where the total contract value is $50,000. A lot of times in your AMs, you'll see the title that it'll be only $15,000, and that's for the current year. And then when you read further in your AM, you'll notice that the current year is $15,000, but we also have potentially options for another, for example, 4 years, which would take the total contract value to $60,000. So in that case, we would come to the assembly for approval.
Yes, Ms. Quinn Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just wondering whether any of this is mirrored on federal or other requirements, and whether it changes based on funding we might receive. For instance, I work for an organization where we receive a lot of federal money, and we have to, following federal procedures, have a competitive multiple bids, requests for bids, maybe different language than what you're using, but for anything over $3,000. So here I see it's $5,000. Is that just a muni rule, or how do we sort of line that up with other rules that might be out there?
Depending on the requirements of the funding agency, we are allowed to change our rules to match theirs.
Okay.
For instance, in the FEMA requirements, FEMA's requirement is, what FEMA says is a micro purchase, which is our small purchase, is $10,000 and under.
Okay.
But FEMA also says that you will use the more restrictive requirement, either your requirement or theirs. So unfortunately, it's $5,000 for us unless it's construction, and then it's $10,000 for a micro purchase.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Constant.
So 2 questions. One, you just used an example of the $15,000 with 4 annual or 3 annual options. When you put that forward, does that encumber $60,000, or does that require that you have a competition that exceeds the $50,000, or does that just get based on the 15 with the 3 options that may be appropriated eventually?
It's the money that we are appropriating is the $15,000. You'll see that on the fund line below on the AM, to where it'll say $15,000 2019, and then the other $40,000 would be 2020 through 2022, subject to appropriation.
So from the perspective of trying to frame which tool to use for procurement purposes, then does that require you use the RFP or ITB because the total potential amount is above 50,000?
These are sole source requirements. That what I'm talking about are sole source requirements where an invitation to bid or RFQ is not used. The sole source is for requirements where the code says it reasonably limits competition. Classic examples are software maintenance. Software maintenance in many cases is only available from the software manufacturer, and so we come to you then for a yearly requirement, say for 2019 software maintenance plus options for 2021, 22. So we don't keep coming back to you every year.
So you definitely answered my second question, because could you give us some more detail on why the sole source function works, because it's not really, it says non-competitive, it's not really fleshed out here. But I want to go back to the first question again and take it out of the context of sole source. Look at any purchasing process. If you had a project that may be 3 years long or 4 years long, and you know this year you want to spend X dollars because you have that money, you may not in the future, and you don't want to award that, but you say it might be an option.
Right.
Do you, in your solicitation, have to account for those future years, or can you just base it on the first year and then contemplate the difference next year?
We will, depending on the requirement again, if we can get a contractor to reasonably price out the option years, we will have the contractor price out the option years, or we'll have a mechanism in the contract to increase that based on maybe a consumer price index.
We're going to have this talk offline. I think I'm asking a different question, but I'm wasting everybody's time. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Oftentimes, part of the reason I think we want to do this sort of training is, for me, when I'm reviewing the packet, there's often a lot of awards to different companies, and I can't tell, based on the memos that are pretty slim, which one it fits into. So sometimes it will just say, this was the lowest bidder, but it doesn't say, this amount was for this amount. Therefore, we use this process. There's the lowest bidder. Or in this situation, we use the RFP, which means the lowest bidder is not just the one that we should select. So I don't know if you all prepare that or if someone else prepares it in the departments, but I think it'd be really helpful for us if there were just 2 or 3 sentences just about what's the framework for how we make our decision, because I think it can be confusing.
Okay, what we try and do in the AMs is we will tell you generally in the title or in the first paragraph that this was an RFP or this was an invitation to bid. And then behind that, because what we're trying to do is take the department memorandum that is generally in more detail, summarize it for you on the AM, so you can look at the AM and go, oh, okay, I understand what that is, or maybe they're not real clear. Let me go back and read the invitation or read the recommendation of award from the department. If we have an invitation to bid, generally on that recommendation of award, you're going to see what's called an abstract that'll show you, we had 5 bidders and they ranged from X dollar to X dollar.
Can I follow up? Thank you. And I guess that now that we're having this training, we're probably going to be more comfortable with all the terms, but I would ask, I don't think it's incredibly difficult just to, in that AM, have a sentence or 2 that says, we use this process, therefore you select the lowest bidder, or therefore you select blah, blah, blah. As a result, we selected this person. Like, just real simple, because I think
that.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, for me at least.
Thank you. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. had a clarifying question concerning POs and contracts. A contract is non-encumbering, and a PO is encumbering.
Yes, ma'am.
Is that the only point in the process when something is encumbered, or are there other ways in which, and maybe that's a question to Mr. Slivka, I'm not sure, show is encumbered?
It's the only way in the purchasing process that we encumber money is through the actual issuance of a PO.
Okay. And some other organizations refer to these as commitments or committed dollars, as I understand it. Maybe not here at the Muni, but I think that's essentially the same thing. It shows something in which we're committed or we intend to pay within that
I'll go through
that academic year, fiscal year.
I'll go through an actual process for you about how we actually get the requirement and then how we fund it.
Okay.
Just a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Weddles. At the end? Okay, sure. Go ahead.
Okay. So I come to the assembly for sole source approvals over $30,000 if they are sole source, and that's total contract value. I have the authority under the code to go up to $50,000 when we use another cooperative agreement, otherwise a contract that has been awarded competitively by another organization, either a purchasing co-op or maybe the school district or the state has awarded a contract. I can go up to $50,000. Greater than $50,000 on those, I come to the assembly for approval. Classic examples are when we buy police cars. We will tag on to a state contract, and it's called piggybacking. greater than $500,000 through the competitive process, I also have to come to the assembly for approval. That is per code. And the question was asked about federal funding. Generally, if we have federal funding, depending on which federal agency has given us the money, there may be some disadvantaged business enterprise goals that are required in specific language that is required. If a contractor is unhappy or a citizen is unhappy with the results of something we have done in purchasing, they have the right to by code, to do what's called an appeal. And they may, another word for appeal is protest. But the code does not use the word protest, it uses the word appeal. And it's a pretty simple process. They may appeal to the mayor or the assembly any decision of the purchasing department. There are no time frames. There are no rules similar to what I think Mr. Dunbar is familiar with in the federal system, that they have to have standing before they can appeal. Any citizen can appeal. And the way they do that is they typically send the mayor a letter, or may send an assembly member a letter, and then that gets referred down to purchasing for us to look at it and make a recommendation to you or the mayor about whether to proceed with an appeal. An appeal means they take it to a 5-member bidding review board.
Yes, Ms. Salto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if I get this right, we get an appeal, or the mayor does, which is a complaint about the decision purchasing made. It goes back to purchasing to decide whether or not it should be further reviewed by the 5-member board.
No, we provide a recommendation.
Well,
if it goes to the mayor, we will provide a recommendation to the mayor to say, based on our view of the merits of this situation, here's everything we either recommend or don't recommend.
But it's a review of your work you've already done.
Yes, ma'am. But it is subject to, I could make a recommendation to the mayor not to convene the bidding review board, and he overturns me and says, no, we want to do that, or to the assembly.
And may I, there's no timeline for how long you have to do that. Is there a typical amount of time that it takes you to go through that process to get
We
back?
process them as expeditiously as possible, because I'm not going to award in the face. I generally will not award a contract in the face of an appeal.
Okay, so the bid's not yet been awarded.
Correct.
Okay. I can talk, with you more offline about the kind of the mechanics of that. So, but we're talking like weeks,
It's
months.
It's typically weeks.
Okay.
And
Thanks.
like I say, and what drives that timeline is the ability to get the bidding review board convened. And then the mechanics of it is purchasing, and the person, the appellant, will make a presentation to the bidding review board. The bidding review board then goes into executive session to make a decision that they will refer. Again, it's a recommendation to the assembly.
Who's on the review board? Are those mayoral appointees?
The mayor appoints them. It's 5 members. And the mayor appoints them approved by the assembly.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Actually, thank you, Ms. Salto. A couple questions that are loading, Ms. LaFrance. So, does the appellant decide whether they want to appeal to the mayor or the assembly?
Yes, it is up to the appellant.
And then, and maybe this is a question for Ms. Jones. So, when if the appellant decides to appeal to the assembly, does that then become a quasi-judicial process?
Mr. Chair, I don't know the answer to that because I've never seen it before.
Me neither.
You're not really handling the appeal. You're saying yes, you should go to the bidding review board.
Okay.
So you're just, and the assembly has done what they wanted to do despite purchasing a number of times, and the bidding review board has quite an independent mind.
Okay. Great. All right. Thank you, Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if we on the assembly were to receive an email where someone says, okay, they disagree, they don't think it was fairly or properly handled, then we would forward that email to you
That
for
would be my
further consideration?
That would be my recommendation. Forward it to me so that I know there is an appeal, so I can delay award, so I can provide you the other side of the story.
Okay, so at that, and if I may, Mr. Chair, and so at that point, we would not necessarily want to request you to convene the review board, but that would just be starting that conversation about additional information. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Wells.
So a couple of questions that come up. So we do these cooperative purchases, and that kind of counts as bidding because it went through a competitive process, maybe through some national organization or something. And you go with that. And I've had some conversations with people who sell stuff. We're not buying from them because we're going with this cooperative bid that they didn't win. But they say, okay, well, we may save 10 or 50% off the list price or whatever, and you tell us that in the documents we get. But they say, well, shoot, you know, I could have been 20% off and been lower. So when do we reevaluate whether we go with these national competitive bid things and just putting it out just to double check here?
We look at those on a case-by-case basis.
How did you know though? I mean, you know, if you're going out for you know, a Volvo grader and you say, well, we can get it here, cooperative purchase, maybe the guy would sell to you, but the guy who's got another grader goes, well, shoot, we got a bunch of them here and I'd blow them out for a third off. How do you even know? Because they're not bidding because you're doing a cooperative purchase. So they're just out of the loop.
Well, I encourage my buyers before they do a cooperative purchase to look at the local market, and that's what they're supposed to be doing. That's what, you know, we have hired them to do, is to be knowledgeable of the local market in which we're buying something. And we may make mistakes sometimes.
But they must be calling just to double check.
Yeah.
Okay, because I wasn't hearing that was happening.
Yeah.
But talking to just a couple people,
No, I mean, and a lot of times what we're doing is we're standardizing based on some studies that have been done, standardizing equipment. Maybe we're only buying cat graders, and the only person we buy a cat grader from is NC. Now you may be hearing from the Volvo guy that says, I get a Volvo grader. Well, we're not going to buy a Volvo grader. We're going to buy a cat because we've standardized to it. We have a number of the parts. The mechanics are trained. We have a warranty station for them. For instance, Ford police cars, we're a warranty dealer for Ford.
Okay, so because that leads to the next question. So then you have kind of the standardized equipment, which philosophically makes a ton of sense. But at some point you need to reevaluate that too. Say, okay, well, for 5 years we've been buying these cars, but in terms of automotive, the whole world changes in 5 years. What's your process for reevaluating?
We rely on the department, for instance, fleet maintenance. Mark Warfield is our fleet manager. Mark is always looking at that, and in particular, yellow iron or cars, we meet with them on a monthly basis in a fleet advisory committee where we talk about those things. And I mean, it's ML&P, it's AWO, it's fleet itself, it's the police department, it's solid waste services. We meet once a month, and they talk about those things. I've been to those meetings, and I send one of my buyers to those meetings all the time, so that they're fairly knowledgeable of those things. And the fleet advisory puts out minutes of the meeting. This illustrates what they talk about.
All right, good. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we're about halfway through your slides, so I just want to make sure we have
The others. And then we do have a local bidder's preference. It's 3%, not to exceed $20,000, because we should be doing buying locally, at least in my opinion, supporting local bidders. The code lays out contract amendment authority about when we have to come to the assembly and when we don't. That's on slide 7. Just going to very briefly touch on that because it can get fairly involved.
I'm sorry, go back to that local bidder preference, 3% not to exceed $20,000. So if we had a $100 million project, we would only give the local bidder $20,000 of credit.
Yes, that's per code. I have no.
That is an area
That may be an area we want to look at.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
But contract amendment authority is on page 7, and I can go through it, or we can proceed. Okay. And what I want to do is just throw a slide in here to illustrate when you're going to see things from purchasing. It's on the assembly agenda, it's part of the consent agenda. You're going to see invitation to bid on 9C. It's called bid awards. 9 Delta under new business. You'll see that's where you'll see RFP awards, recommendation of awards for RFPs, contract amendments or change orders that exceed the authority listed on the previous slide, and you'll see sole source and non-competitive requests. That's in 9 Delta. That's the portions of the code where you will see things from purchasing, or not code, where part of the agenda.
Okay, sure. I have a couple questions there. Mr. Weddleton and Ms. Elton.
You know, this gets down to kind of the flow of our meetings. You know, so we'll have sole sources for small amounts, a whole bunch of them on there. And I just as soon see a spreadsheet, company, dollar amount, you know, who was who, kind of basic information to summarize and have 10 of them all at once or something. Is that we required to have each one as a separate ordinance or resolution?
Yes.
And could it be a separate ordinance resolution, but it's all on one page and you discount like this instead of asking for 2 pages?
You might not have the detail that you want if you do that to be able to make a decision on why is the sole source there. But it's per code that says we'd have, and we can amend the code, but it says each requirement needs to have specific items. The time frame, the dollar value, the vendor, the reason why.
Standard equipment, only vendor. That's kind of, but when I read this stuff, that's what I'm circling. Okay, moving on, but it takes me 5 pages.
I'm
look for
open to
this
that,
idea.
but we'll have to modify the code if we want to change that.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. You're going to be busy, Mr. Gates. Ms. Elton.
Would you mind if I scoot in just because it's exactly about this?
Sure.
Is that okay? I was just going to say that Dee and I and Barbara and others have been talking about that. Eric was really interested in trying to eliminate some of the stuff that's really small and that we probably don't need to spend time on an individual resolution. So as part of our review of assembly procedures, Dee's been looking at that. So hopefully we'll have the proposal to make that a little more efficient.
John, that can be handled.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We had an item come up before us that was, we needed to purchase it like now. It was with regard to the police department last meeting. Is there a standard timing that you guys generally like to have? Is there policies and procedures in place of when departments should be getting in touch with you? Instead of like, you have to decide this like right now because it's expiring, you know, in 2 days.
Yes, ma'am. We try and get the departments to give us the AMs for the, basically it's the Wednesday after the assembly meeting. We need them that day or we actually need them earlier to be able to process them through the system.
I'm sorry, maybe my question wasn't clear. Is there a policy and procedure if they see that they're going to need to be purchasing something? How far in advance? I mean, of course, most notice is great, but is there kind of a not a cutoff date, but a date like by which you guys want them 30 days before the expiration of something, or when they're going to need it, or 90 days? Because it really can put us in a bind. I mean, put you in a bind too, where it's like, oh, we suddenly have to rush through something, and we may not be able to get the information we want because we're kind of held up against a deadline.
The code requires that formal competitive requirements be on the street at minimum of 14 days. So if you back that up, it's got to be on the street 14 days, has to be through the AM process by a certain date. It's generally a month before at least. RFPs run longer because of the evaluation process that the departments have to go through. It varies requirement by requirement. If there comes up an emergency, I can always go to the mayor to waive Title VII to get an immediate award. And we've done that a couple of times.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gates, then Mr. Weddleton.
No.
Okay, Mr. Weddleton.
So, and this may be years ago prior to you, so not picking on you, but I know AWU had got independent, had its own purchasing department for a while. Then it came back to the beauty one, and they were really upset because they said it's so slow, we don't get projects through, and stuff gets delayed a year because of different things. When we had it internal, we got things done like that. Is that true? Do they not have the code requirements that we might have? That speeds them up? What would cause that situation?
What caused the situation with AWU was they still had a code requirement, but instead of coming to the assembly, they went through their AWU board. When they came back to us, there was some initial heartburn, but we've gotten over that. And I have not heard any issues from AWU in a while.
This all goes back many, many years.
It goes back to 2010, 2011.
Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar.
Just going off of what John just asked about, so we were about to sell an OMP, so obviously we won't be, God willing. So assuming that goes through, they'll no longer be using your shop, correct? Now you charge them a certain amount of IGCs, right?
Yes.
So are you going to reduce your staffing or reduce your hours by the amount equal to the IGCs they were paying? Or are you going to have to raise your IGC rates for all the remaining utilities and departments to accommodate the fact that you're no longer being paid by MLP?
Once MLNP is gone, we will look at staffing to make sure that staffing is not overboard. Right now, we are, in my opinion, understaffed for the work that we do. All I can say is we're going to look at that. And if I have to reduce staff, then I'll do that in conjunction with my boss.
Thank you. Go ahead.
And the other area of the assembly agenda that you will see information from purchasing is the information or reports. On a monthly basis, I provide a report to you on sole sources that were approved between 10 and 30,000, and I provide you a separate additional report on those competitive awards between $50,000 and $500,000. The remainder of the slides should go fairly quickly. If you want to see where those solicitations are advertised, that's on page 9. It is on the municipal website, muni.org, under business, purchasing, bidding, opportunities online. We post our requirements there, we post the results. We have at least 9 years worth of history on the website of the results because we try and be as transparent as possible. Slide 8, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about SAP, the modules that are used by purchasing. We use what's called the SRM module, Supplier Relationship Module. That's where all the purchase orders are created and contracts are stored. Just so folks know, we also now email all purchase orders to vendors. We do not use the Postal Service anymore. We tried to move to the 20th century, so email all of our purchase orders to vendors. In addition, in an attempt to move forward, we no longer take paper applications from vendors. That's done to what's called a registration of suppliers. ROS, that's where a vendor will come and register electronically so that they can receive their purchase orders when they're awarded. And we also have the ability for a vendor to update his information in the supplier self-service module, the SUS module. The last slide, I just want to give you an appreciation of the workload that we do. In 2018, we did 6,094 purchase orders. We obligated about $254 million through either 60 formal solicitation, construction bids. This is a typical activity. We also have a very active credit card program that we earn a rebate on. Last year, in the rebate year, 2018 to 2019, we received $183,000 of rebate from JP Morgan Chase. We did about 48,000 transactions, roughly $19.6 million of activity. If we had been able to put another $400,000 on our activity, our rebate would have gone up roughly to another $6,000. In a typical year, we will obligate around $250+ million a year.
And one of the things that we're looking at from a revenue enhancement standpoint is working with the vendor. It's like your cash back. So we get right now it's 1.25, 1.45. If we can take this up, and based on just the existing relationships we have, to $40 million a year, we get an extra $300,000 a year because we get a higher level of rebate back. In order for us to want to do that, though, we have to spend roughly that amount of money to get better programming on the interface so that this doesn't create a cascade of problems in the accounting department. But we are very actively looking at a way to increase the amount of rebate that we get.
And with that, I'll just finish up. So far this year, we have done yesterday, we have done 2,351 purchase orders, obligating roughly $137 million.
Thank you. A couple questions. Mr. Dunbar.
Yeah, related to my previous question, can you give me a rough estimate on any of these metrics, the percent of which is MLP?
I don't have it right now, but yes, I can. I've got that information.
Are you comfortable, like, off the top of your head, giving a very rough estimate? Like, is it a tenth? Is it a fifth?
It's not a third. It's a little bit less than a third.
That's a big chunk. Then.
It is a big chunk.
So maybe as much as a quarter, 25%.
You're just talking about your activity of
yes.
Your department is distinct from IGCs across the entire municipality.
Yeah. I'm talking about this. Purchase orders, funds obligated, going through your office. Right. It could be as much as a quarter of your business.
Thank you. So, question I have. DBEs, is that still run through OEO and Heaven?
Yes. The DBE program is run through the OEO department.
I forget the full acronym. Could you? It's disadvantaged business.
Disadvantaged business enterprise. It applies normally to AWU requirements because they have some specific funding requirements to do DBE requirements. They have specific goals there. And then some federal departments, if we get federal money, has specific requirements. I think Federal Highways Administration for one, Transit, FDA, Merrill-Field, those departments normally have some federal money that will require DBE requirements.
And have we run into any issues with any of these minority-owned businesses with our current purchasing practices, or are they able to navigate?
They're able to navigate, and then I do a number of outreach when requested, and then through the State of Alaska DBE, they run a symposium conference every year. I'm invited to be a panel member to that. The Procurement Technical Assistance Center run by the university that does small business schools. I'm invited to attend them, their meetings, and various outreach programs that are requested. I'm always available to present how the municipality does business.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Happ? Okay. Thank you so much. All right, so I think we have a little bit of a break before we hear from Mr. Falsey. Do we have lunch yet? Or is that going to be coming soon?
We don't have lunch yet.
Okay.
I'm sure it will be here soon. I do have something else for you, Mr. Chair. We've updated your contact information. This is public information. I would particularly like our new members to take a look at it because it's got your voicemail. And so I want to make sure that, and it's, for some of you it has your cell phone. I want to make sure that you want this information to be public. So if you could just X if it's good and make any corrections directly on it, and we'll get this corrected and posted on the website. Do you need an extra? Are you writing with your right hand?
I got it. Yeah,
Okay,
I'm
great.
right-handed.
Good. All right. So now we have the last session of this assembly retreat training. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Falsey for utilities and enterprise departments.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have whipped together the finest presentation that I could come up in the 20 minutes before I came down here and asked Barbara what I'm supposed to be doing, and right this very moment. This is going to have a few words, but I think it will provide grounding in what enterprises and utilities in the municipality are generally. So, start with the enterprises and the utilities. What are they? They're on the board here. The municipal enterprises are 3 in number: Merrill Field, Gulfport, and the Anchorage Community Development Authority, which you can also think of as subsuming Easy Park. Utilities. We have AWU, MLP, and SWS. And the trick question always is, how many utilities do we have? There's not 3, there's sort of formally 5, but we'll explain that. AWU is 2 different certificates of public necessity and convenience, so it's really split into 2 sides, the sewer side and the water side, which are 2 different utilities. And solid waste services, likewise, split in 2, between the collection side and the disposal side. And not all of them are area-wide. So the municipality is the size of Delaware, stretching all the way to the mountains where people haven't really been. But the utilities are all, with one exception, within a smaller geographic boundary. So to get a first sense of what they are, let's look at where they are. On the water side, AWU's water certificate area is most of the Anchor Bowl, although not all of the hillside, and then most of the Eagle River area. On the sewer side, there's a huge chunk of the hillside that is totally missing. If you want to know what these things are, I think if you want some sense of what they do, how many people they employ, and how much money they're spending. So that's going to be the rhythm here. So it's structured like you might imagine a water and wastewater utility structure with all the components of the machine that you need to run the enterprises. We are, despite the fact that it is split into 2 sides, it's reported from a personnel side as being blended, and the lived experience is if you walk down to AWU and said, are you a water employee or a wastewater employee, we'll probably look at you sideways and not know what you're talking about. There are 295 people, 297 people working down at AWU. The budgets, however, are split in half. So on the water side, what the Assembly actually does is approve its annual operating budget and its annual capital budget. On the operating side, we appropriate $49 million-ish a year on the water side, and on the wastewater side, another $47 million a year-ish. So altogether, AWU, almost 300 people, $90 million-ish. Okay. On the MLP, I think we're all pretty familiar with the MLP service territory now. It is the footprint of the old city of Anchorage before unification. Structured much like you might imagine, electrical utility, 2D structured. And it is about 274 employees. Their budgets, you would think, might be a little bit simpler because they are one and only one certificated utility, but nothing can ever be that simple, so they actually have 2 budgets that are approved every year. The first is the intuitive one, the regular electric budget, and there we're putting out $144 million a year, but they also acquired a gas field, so they have a separate budget which reports all the gas field expenses, and we're appropriating $15 million a year on that side too. And like I say, the Assembly approves both the operating budgets and the capital budgets this year. Last of the utilities, solid waste services. This is the collection area. I don't know the deep history of how it ended up in this very tessellated checkerboard kind of pattern. It's mostly within the original city footprint, but it's not even entirely all of the city footprint. That's the collection side, and we do have a mandatory collection area there.
Wait, can I ask a question about
Yeah.
Felix? There's a bunch of area that isn't red or blue. What's going on there?
Like I say, that's in the category of things I don't know. I'd be happy to
Oh, you
answer.
said that. Okay.
Also, if I could ask, your chart labels of the legend is a little bit weird. Blue solid collection area, red stripe collection area. That part's obvious What's the difference between those?
Oh, I think I stole this from election days. So I think like
Okay.
red is Tuesday and blue is Tuesday.
Okay. Monday, the blue,
The disposal utility side of solid waste services really is the area-wide side because it is the landfill and the central transfer station and the German transfer station. We do have a code provision which dates back to 1983 that everything's got to be put there unless you have some special exemptions that the director has authorized. Okay, they're structured much like you might imagine a garbage utility to be structured. Customer service, finance, engineering, and disposal collector. There are about 150 people strong, and there too, if you were to ask somebody on solid service center, are you on the collection side or the disposal side, they would have no idea what you're talking about. And of course, and have a lived experience being one unified utility. But we have two budgets. So on the refuse side, which is the disposal side, we are annually appropriating about $11.5 million, so it's significantly smaller utility than a KU and NLP utility. And on the disposal side, about $19 million. Okay, turning to the enterprises, the three enterprises, Mineral Field, the org chart is almost as big as the number of people who actually work there. There are 9.5 people who are working at Mineral Field, and they split almost evenly between inside and outside. So there are 4 or 5 people who are working inside the main office there, and then 4 or 5 people who are running around the grounds doing snow clearance, some fences and whatnot. Their budget is a lot smaller. We just appropriated almost $2 million, and we have a whole special work session on Mineral Field's finances next Friday. They have kind of a complicated recent history on their budget where they have been running effectively a structural deficit that was being masked by money from a land exchange that happened about 5 years ago, and we kind of need to right that ship. So we'll get into that in great detail next Friday. And then second to last, the port. About 20 people work down at the port. We are annually appropriating about $15 million in the port, which is, as a side note, sort of the sobering reality of the need to find somewhere in excess of $1 billion to rebuild the port on a machine that's annually appropriating and spending $15 million. It's not like it's squirreling away hundreds of millions of other dollars that we're not appropriating. It's the amount of cash that are really flowing through the port. Last is the Anchorage Community Development Authority, last of the 3 enterprises, and it is really different in kind from the other enterprises and utilities. Here the org chart sort of shows the board of directors at the apex rather than there. That is the lived experience. I have supervisory responsibilities over the 3 utilities and 2 enterprises we've already talked about, but no line authority over ACDA. Our direct interaction with ACDA, which is Andrew Halcro's shop, is that we have 2 board positions, and they are Alex and Chris Schutte. I actually cannot tell you the number of people who are currently employed there because we report their budgets, but not in the same way that we report everybody else's. I don't know if Alex knows roughly the number of people there, but they have a number of people working there because they do all the parking enforcement downtown. On an annual basis, they're getting about $9 million appropriated, but they aren't making money. They're actually losing a little bit of money. Okay.
On a cash flow
On a
basis,
cash flow.
they are making money on a after depreciation.
So why do we have this special carve out for enterprises and utilities at all? The real big difference here is that these are services that are being provided for and funded by ratepayers or users rather than taxpayer citizens. So the money that goes into ABU is all exclusively from the ABU bills. The money that goes into NLP is all exclusively from rate collections, likewise from SWS, likewise from Merrill Field and from the port. General government and tax dollars don't flow in at all to those enterprises. Now that's kind of been a topic du jour on Merrill Field. There are people at Merrill Field who think that's not fair, that all the other airports in Alaska are subsidized by somebody. We should get subsidized too. We haven't been willing to cross that room line, and I think that's going to be our only position for as long as we still feel like we have a lot of unmet needs in general government too. But that's the functional difference. This is all ratepayer money, and it's all separately accounted for in the budgetary process.
actually have a question for you, Mr. Dunbar.
Yeah, I don't know. Is specific questions related to one of these that appropriate for now, or do you want to wait until some later time to talk about stuff? Felix, I mean, this is your show.
Sure. Yeah, you can go ahead and ask the question now.
I wanted to ask about ACDA, and for the new members, you might know that we basically used the ACDA in a really creative way last year to purchase a building downtown that has become our new police headquarters, and we pay a pretty substantial rent there, or we're starting to, right? I guess, no, we have been. And so my question is, there was a talk at that time about us purchasing the building outright. How is that internal conversation going? And what would it look like if we decided to do that?
So, through the chair, I don't have the latest on that. I know that we have sent Robin Ward over to somebody at ACDA to take the temperature about that. A lot of ways can go down. One is you could just get completely good graces, be in the complete good graces of ACDA, and they can just say, fine, we'll just completely recharacterize our current lease as a lease purchase, and nothing else changes except at the end of this, you'll own the building. Maybe they would get there. I suspect because they are also a commercial actor in the sense that they want to be able to do wheeling and dealing, that they'll probably want something if they're not going to end up with the building at the end of the lease term. So that could mean they would want, all right, we'll convert it to a lease purchase, but you have to pay us more than the current level of rent in your current lease, or you got to pay more years of rent on that end. So it's like a 40-year term rather than a 35-year term. I think at this point, I believe the overture has been made, but I don't know that there's anything that's been ripened into a real proposal yet. The other thing about that arrangement is that the building is sort of in the municipal family writ large, even if it remains an ACDA. The consequence of it being forever an ACDA would just be that there's a stream of money that is flowing to ACDA. If ever ACDA got super rich and that happy, then we could declare a dividend from ACDA too. So I don't know.
Just from a structural standpoint, I think Bill said it accurately. We have no intention of doing anything to the financing. That has some real significant costs if we were to alter the financing of the purchase. The contractual arrangement between ACDA and the Muni ends up being a net positive to ACDA about $200,000 a year, but out of that $200,000, they have to pay for if something breaks in the building. So it's not it's a fair arrangement, I guess is the best way to say it. It's not an overly generous arrangement with ACDA.
Yeah, I just kind of follow up on that quickly. I agree. I mean, this is why we did it. I agree with everything you both just said. I do think that there is sort of a public perception that we don't currently own, for those who've been paying attention, that we don't currently own our police department. Headquarters. And in however many years, when that lease comes done, people will say, oh, well, now we've got to do it again, and we still don't own the building, much like we don't own this building. And that's a terrible state of affairs. You end up paying for way more than it should. Now, the truth of the matter is we're paying ourselves, and they're doing the maintenance and all that rest. So that way it's a lot different than this building. But I do think there's a sort of public perception portion. And I think we should continue to have that discussion. Like, for example, what you just said right now makes a lot of sense, Mr. Falsey. Like, if it was going to go from a $200,000 cash flow for them to a $230,000 cash flow for them per year, that's, I think, something like that. It's just a number I'm throwing out there. Well worth it to us to own the thing at the end. And then, they have to make that internal decision about whether that little sweetener is worth it to them. Now, that's without us using the actual hammer that we have on them, which is like you just said. We could say, you now owe us a dividend, right? Or there are other things we could do, I think, to sort of squeeze them in a way. But I understand why we wouldn't want to, because we do want them to have some independence in their actions from us. But at the end of the day, they also should be doing sort of in the best interest of the municipality. That's why these kind of pseudo-private entities are, I think, so difficult to get your head around. But I'm just glad to hear the conversation is still ongoing. And again, I lean towards, I would like us to own the thing at the end of the lease.
Thank you. Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you describe the sort of legal mechanism by which enterprises exist? I mean, we sort of talk about them as being a part of the muni, but they're separate. And then along those lines, for ACDA, I know two assembly members, Mr. Constant and I, serve on the board, but it always feels like a little bit of a conflict to me, because here we are, just listening to sort of Forrest's line of questioning about ACDA and how do we, the muni, get a better deal out of ACDA. There's this sort of inherent conflict, but then ultimately, they're both muni entities. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so through the chair, it ends up being a little fuzzier than you might imagine. So the charter refers to the existence of utilities and enterprises, but it doesn't define them, and it doesn't create any real rules for what they are, other than to say that they're separately budgeted. And I think that's because there's such a received tradition of what a utility and an enterprise are, and the real difference is the ratepayer dollars versus taxpayer dollars, and they kind of have a separate existence. I don't know that all the enterprises and utilities even have, for instance, a separate tax ID number, but they have a separation from general government that is meaningful in a couple ways. One is the budget process. All of their budgets are outside of taxpayer dollars, outside of general government, tended to separately. Another is for raising money to do capital projects. So when AIMU wants to build a big pipe, or NLP wants to repair a transformer, or Solid Waste Services wants to build a new central transfer station, they borrow the money and they issue revenue bonds. And the bonds are secured not by the full faith and credit of the municipality of Anchorage or by the implicit promise that we will tax people to make up if ever the utility goes bankrupt, but only by the revenues of the utility. So whatever we're collecting in water bills, electric bills, and garbage bills. And that's sort of the critical financial difference. Beyond that, as I'll show in a couple slides here, maybe I'll just move that right now actually. Why do you guys care about all these things? One of the reasons you care about them is that you control them all, and you set, for the most part, at least initially, the rules for all of them. So it's ambiguous because there's no one provision that says the municipality hereby declares the following things to be utilities or can create utilities, or utilities are required to have the following forms. But there is a section in the code for all of these things where you guys have set the rules for how they get to operate. So municipal airports, Merrill Field lives in transportation, and it's mostly rules about like runway incursions and like.
Sorry, Mr. Paulson, before you continue, did you have anything for Mr. Davidson? No? Okay, sorry, I have a couple more questions. Okay. Mr. Weddleton and Mr. Constant.
Wait, are you done?
I'll plow into the rest of it. We'll catch up to the rest of it.
Well, I'm switching gears back. I'm going back to Ford's point on ACDA. I wasn't concerned. I actually think it's kind of nice that we don't own it. It goes into this other pocket. It's just different pockets in the same pair of pants. But it goes, money goes back to ACDA because they could do things we can't do as a government. I think we saw that with buying the LIO building. We got a great deal. They could act fast. They didn't have to go through what are fairly, I think, not inappropriate, but very cumbersome purchasing things or to vote for the bond and all this stuff. I think the task there is to make sure that ACDA is meeting municipal goals and whatever it would be, buying a building that we need or buying a piece of property, running a structured parking in Spenard or whatever it might be. Do we have control to make sure they do that?
I guess the mayor does appoint the board for ACDA, so the mayor does have that authority to make board appointments. The two assembly members are ex officio, and then you have the two municipal employees who are actual board members. You've said it right. I mean, it is a component of the municipality with this distinct corporate separation so that they can act independently. But I think, as Bill said, there is, at the end of the day, we're one tax ID.
Cool. Thank you, Mr. Wells. Mr. Constant.
Yeah, back to what Mr. Dunbar was suggesting, I think we would be wise to figure out, and sooner than later, a mechanism at which at some point we no longer pay $2 million, $3 million a year in rents, because those dollars too could have a great impact on any industry or business or work or constituent concern we have going forward. And so imagine 40 years down the road, we've already paid for the building in rents. Are we going to pay for it twice and 3 times? Because then it certainly verges onto an expense outside of what is reasonable for our needs. And so I think that there's a balance in between those two factors of we want to have them be free to develop and do the work that we charge them to, and at the same time we don't want to get kind of buried under an endless stream of expenses that we could not be having to pay. So there's definitely, I think, a line in the middle.
Thank you. Anything further, Mr. Dunbar?
Yeah, I just wanted, what you just said was interesting, the fact that we all are under one tax ID number, whether that's, I don't know if you actually know that or not, but let's assume that it is. That means, I think, that if they get sued, we get sued, correct?
I think that is correct. I know that when we do all of our rate filings for all the utilities, they are really in the form of municipality of Anchorage doing business as municipal light and power.
So if ACDA got sued, for example, we would have to step in and defend them, right? Or would they hire outside counsel and defend themselves?
We've looked into this, and I don't really want to speculate because I'll probably just make that and get it wrong. But this is a question that's come up before because we've actually tried to figure out if the municipal attorney's office is the attorney for ACDA, and I don't remember those chips landed. But that might actually be specified in the code. I think ACDA does feel like it has a bit more separation from us because we don't have line authority over its executive director or its employees in the way that we do over everything else. So that's an interesting question I don't really answer.
Yeah, I mean, that bothers me a little bit, that they could be out there with us having relatively little authority over them, and then we get sued because of something they did. So that's one thing. The other thing that I'm curious about is we are selling MLMP and to Chugach, but if there's any sort of claim that is now sort of, there's a claim that's right now coming to maturity, or something we are doing right now, MLP is doing right now. My understanding is even after we sell MLMP, it's still the municipality of Anchorage that will be sued. Correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. We are still liable even after MLP is gone. Not for the things they do afterwards, but for anything that's happening now.
I believe that is correct, and again, I'll want to defer to Becky to give the real answer, but my recollection is that is the way it works because we're getting all of the value of MLP as it exists the moment we transfer it, so they're hidden liabilities, they don't pass with it, they stick with them on life.
And we aren't actually getting rid of the tiny legal entity called MLMP, right? We've talked about that. Like even after we sell all the assets and we allow people to transfer with them, we might still have some tiny little entity that like runs a Klutna.
Yeah, in fact, yes. So the current proceeding before the RCA, specifically on the MLP's Chugach Electric transaction, is now 3 different RCA proceedings which have all been merged together. One relates specifically to the Beluga River unit and the way sales happen. That was sort of unexpectedly merged in. But the 2 main ones are, can Chugach Electric amend their certificate to buy MLP and take over the MLP service territory? And ours is, can we amend our certificate to shrink it down to just Eklutna? So it would exist as a utility that is only certificated to make sales of the power station.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Okay, so trying to figure out why you guys care about these things. We figured out what they do, how many people they have, how much money they're spending. The other is you guys make the rules for all of them. And so I just give you a quick sense of where you can find all of those things and what a flavor of what those rules are. The airport and the port both live in Title 11 transportation, the same way as you find all of the taxi rules. And that actually kind of gives you a sense about what these rules are all about. If you plow into them, it's mostly about like who can berth at the docks and whether you're allowed to bring explosives in random places and what kind of powers the directors of the port and the airport have to issue rules for how the fields work. The utilities are all found in a more natural place where we do have one whole title that is based on utilities, and we have rules for all the different versions of the utilities and general rates, rules of procedure there. But a lot of it you will not find in our code at all, because it will instead be in the tariffs. And the tariffs exist for MLP, for the water side of AWU, for wastewater side of AWU, and for both collections and disposal side of solid waste services. And that is partly because of the RCA, which I'm about to talk about, and partly because that's just the way utilities have always operated. this is where you find the rules about who has to pay for what and what amounts they have to pay. And for all of those across the board, they don't get to just pick it up themselves. They have to propose a tier to you, and you have to say yes or no. And that may really hit the road for too much longer on Port of Alaska. Final thought before I turn to the RCA. The Anchorage Community Development Authority is in a totally non-intuitive place. It is in the public lands chapter of the code, and it more forcefully explains how the Community Development Authority is legally structured and what its powers are and what its missions are. It really is a sort of soup to nuts, A to Z description of this thing, and that is because it really does have more of an independent financial existence, and it can take on liabilities that we couldn't take on and or we would not be nimble enough to take on, but it's sort of buried in a strange place because it's really been conceived of as a real estate entity. But it has been given all of the parking revenues for downtown. So I don't know the full history, but once upon a time we had the parking authority. The Community Development Authority is a relatively new creation. I think 2008 is when it comes into existence, and Robin Ward had a lot to do with it. It's not unusual. Most localities in Lower 48 and elsewhere do have these community development authorities where you give them some specific revenue stream and you say, go be nimble and go make the world a better place with that money, specifically in a real estate kind of way. And we've done that more recently with the police headquarters, and there's been some development up in Government Hill, Mountain View.
We both gave them property as well as the revenue from that property. I would point out that the code does create the form that the chief fiscal officer does have control of the finances. So we actually have their money. They're not running off doing things without our knowledge or our help.
Okay, so I mentioned the RCA.
Actually, really briefly, Mr. Constant.
Just the note from Mr. Weddleton that should they come up with a parking garage in Spinard, they will likely also come up with parking meters. That was just a double edge.
Yeah, well, I think if ACT expanded to Spinard, I think you would have to change the code because I think they can wheel and deal anywhere real estate wise, but at least their parking authority I think is bounded to downtown. Again, we could find that answer if we pulled up 2530. So the RCA, another reason utilities feel different in kind from some of the other things that you get to decide is that you don't have full control over what a few of the utilities are doing. So let's see. The punchline is the RCA is, I skipped over the punchline. It's empowered by state law to ensure that there are reasonable rates, terms, and conditions that utilities are applying to ratepayers. In practice, they are regulating not either part of SWS, but both sides of AWU and MLNP. And there's this very complicated statute that people have been interested in as a result of the sale, which sets the following Baroque rule. Public utilities owned and operated by political subdivisions of the state are exempt from the RCA. So far, so good. However, a utility or electric operating entity that is owned or operated by a political subdivision that directly competes with another utility or electrical operating entity is subject to the RCA. So MLP makes sales outside of the municipality, so it is now subject to the RCA. And any other utility or electric operating entity owned or operated by the political subdivision is then also subject to the chapter. So because MLP makes sales to Golden Valley, everybody's in. But wait, I thought we said SWS was out. That's right, because the commission can then say, we can grant an exception to regulation based in public interest, and they did that for solid waste way back in the day, in the early 80s. So super complicated, but the punchline ends up being AWU is in, MLP is in, SWS is out. And for you, that means that when SWS brings you wild ideas and code changes, you say yes or no, and that's the answer. When MLP or AWU brings a rate filing to you, they're proposing a tariff, but what they're really asking you is, can I ask the RCA for permission to do this? And if you say yes, then they take it to the RCA. And the RCA is really the final word on that. Also, there have been a lot of questions about if the ML&P sale is consummated, does that mean that that last tree that we just talked about now completely collapses and Able is also out? And I have an email which I did not fish out that explains the answer is possibly, but not with certainty, because I think we do have to petition the RCA to pull that out. And you guys could decide, there's certainly a provision of state code that could, where you guys could ask for any of the utilities to be regulated. So it's not a clear black and white thing.
Felix, can I?
Sure. Sorry.
If you know, Mr. Falsey, can you tell me how many commissioners there are and how they're appointed, I assume by the governor, and how often they're appointed?
There are 5 RCA commissioners. They are all appointed by the governor. I don't know what their terms are, but it happens with some frequency. Right now, I can remember, I think, 4 of the commissioners. So we have former Mayor Dan Sullivan, just appointed by Dunleavy. We have former ML&P employee Anthony Scott, who was appointed by Walker. Steve McAlpine, sorry, is the chair, was appointed by Walker. And I think Hickett and Wilson? I don't know.
A bunch of guys, that's weird.
Susan Knowles was on the commission.
To be clear,
back in the day when they
have
restricted
a
our
woman
dividends.
running ML&P. So.
Oh, well then it's all fine.
No, we're selling that one.
We hired her for a few months. That's nice of us.
Okay, so why do you care about these things? They've provided important services to people. You guys set the rules, but also we are supposed to be running them according to the code that has been set by the Anchorage Community Assembly for the utilities to generate revenue back to us. And that is because they are really businesses that are wholly owned by a single shareholder, who is us, the municipality of Anchorage, or the taxpayer. In practice, the RCA has the ability to preclude us from receiving a dividend if they determine that the capital of the utility is impaired or may become impaired. And they determined that ALU, on both sides, had impaired capital in the early 80s, and it was pretty clear that the capital was impaired. Their debt to equity ratio was like 7%. They were like 93% debt and 7% equity or something like that. And on the MLP side, they have said yes, they have said no, but they turned off the dividend the first week we were in office in like 2015. That is a big thing for general government, because when the MLP dividend, which was $7 million at the time, just winked out of existence, that is money that is above the tax cap. So when that $7 million disappeared, there was no way to backfill it with taxes. You just have to eat that cut. As part of that MLP sale, we are asking for the MLP dividend restriction to be lifted. So the consequence would be most of the value is returned to us, put in the MOA trust fund, and then it spins off an MOA trust fund dividend. But we would also be no longer having to trap money from any kind of equipment sales as a result of that former dividend restriction. And there was recent development on the ALU side, which is that we have showed progress on, I forget which one it was, water or sewer, one of the two, where we have gotten our debt equity ratio up to the respectable amount, which is the sort of a 35-65, and shown that it will hang there. And so we asked them, can we have the dividend restriction lifted for one side? And they said yes, but with a healthy dose of skepticism that said, do not treat this as a piggy bank. We just passed a new ordinance that you saw for the first time being operationalized in the last budget season, where we were trying to be much more thoughtful and business-like about how we really declare dividends. And we're doing it on SWS too, because what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Even though the RCA doesn't have oversight on SWS, there have been times in the past where general government has said, hey, SWS, how much money do you have in your wallet? Give it all to me right now. And that's not really good for anybody in the long run. But we declared, even though the RCA said we could take a dividend from one half of ALU, we recommended 0 this year, because we actually didn't think it was a smart thing to do right now. I think next year we probably will recommend a modest dividend in ALU's plan. That's not a question.
Yes, Mr. Dunbar, then Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you. So Dan Sullivan has stated publicly that he's opposed to the MLP sale. What are the recusal or challenge procedures, if any, at the RCA?
Through the chair, I don't know that he's saying he was opposed to the sale. He definitely wrote some op-eds where he said I had bizarre and crazy and shifting explanations. But in any event, he's already recused. The MLP Chugach transaction, the MLP restriction of the certificate and the related Beluga River unit are only being heard by 3 commissioners, and they are McAlpine and the 2 I'm not sure I remember, and Anthony Scott and Mayor Dan are both recused.
Great.
And we didn't, as I understand, request that. I think the chair did that on his own.
Well, that's really encouraging. But is there an en banc, or is there any chance it would go to the full board after this decision?
I don't think so, but I can't promise that I know the answer to that question. I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think my question may have been answered. Originally, it was about the role of the RCA and SWS not being regulated by the RCA. At first, I thought I heard that the RCA was the driver behind recommending no dividend, but that was an MOA decision entirely, correct?
Yes. So we, in the wake of the 2015 decision that we could no longer take the dividend from MLP, we looked at the rules, and the rules are the capital utility has to be impaired, or the RCA believes it will become impaired.
Good.
The RCA said at the time, MLP's capital is not impaired, but we're worried because you keep promising us these equity management plans that don't really come to fruition, and so we're turning it off. And we thought, well, okay, I think I hear the message there. They have seen general government just slurp $5 million out of SWS, and they are worried that we're going to wake up one day and do that again with MLP. So we wrote an ordinance that said we're going to be thoughtful about it. We're going to put sideboards on it and say we're only going to look at sort of the equivalent of the net income of the utility. We're not going to take all of the net income of the utility. We're going to have the utilities recommend it to us, and then you guys have to look at their reasoning and see if that is good, bad, or other. And I suppose we could have at that time said those rules will only apply to the ones that the RCA messes with. But it actually is better practice for general government not to have the ability just to take all the cash from the utility when it's in a bad way. So we went to the code where the utility revenue distribution rules live. It applies to all the utilities evenly, and we figured it should. So we made it apply to SWS. And in the first instance, SWS had been budgeted for much larger dividend. But when we really looked at it, we said, no, it's actually not good for them to give us all that money. And so we implemented this time around that collection paid nothing, and that disposal paid a reduced dividend from the original budget, but that was in part of what they included in their long-term projections when we were restructuring all of their fees to make the central transfer station.
Thanks. And second question,
Sure.
Mr. Chair. So at some point, maybe not here because it may be a bigger answer, I would be curious to hear your opinion as to whether or not regulation is a positive thing, or what are the pros and cons if we were to consider that for other utilities, for SWS.
Yeah, through the chair, I think there's not a black and white answer to that question. There's certainly considerations on both sides. On the one hand, the RCA is an independent entity that has the ratepayers in mind, and that's its sole charge, and it doesn't get swayed by whatever sort of the immediate acute political need of the day is, and so there's some kind of safeguards there. On the other hand, it's a very expensive and very slow safeguard that also means that utilities can be potentially less nimble. So I think, for instance, solid waste services have been doing a lot of really innovative things that would have been much harder to pull off if they had to do a kind of letter may I process for the RCA. And there is a line on all the regulated utilities bills. If you look at your water bill or your electric bill, it's the regulatory cost charge, which is just the ratepayers paying for all the lawyers and all of the rate filings that we have to do with the RCA. It's always they don't have to pay that because they don't have to do that. I think, like I say, it would be a wholesome topic of conversation when we get to it, but there are certainly pros and cons on both sides.
And a pro might be having some agility when it comes to your bear-resistant trash can ordinance. I mean, with the other utilities being regulated and maybe not being able to provide the same options so quickly. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So the other thing I was going to say about this then is, so we figured out what they do, how how many people they employ, how much money they have, why do you care? Because you set the rules, and potentially because you get some money to spend from them. I think having this more sensible, rigorous dividend distribution policy in place means that we now have a structural incentive to care more about how efficiently the utilities are running. Because we've tied our hands and said, if you're losing cash, we're not going to take a dividend anymore. And we're asking you to project your dividends going forward. Make us a promise, hit this target. And if they can't do it at the end of the year, they write us a memo and say, well, we didn't do it because X, Y, or Z. I think we care about that in a way that we didn't necessarily have the same investment in before. So I actually think this is one of the structural pieces of governance that we have materially improved while we do it. I think this will be better for all of us going forward and lead to more interesting work utilities really up to. Okay, why else do we care about these things? Because on your agendas, every Tuesday, you're buying trucks and spreaders and weird things that we didn't even know existed. And that is because all of these utilities and the enterprises, with the exception of ACPA, are subject to the purchasing code. And I don't know how much hand-wringing that has involved in years past, but ACPA, I think, I ran out of time before I could pull up chapter and verse, is largely, maybe exclusive entirely, yes, outside of Title VII.
Outside of Title
So
VII.
you don't buy trucks for the parking authority, and you don't approve any of their contracts. And that's an interesting observation.
I will mention that they have similar operating guidelines that the municipality does, and that their purchasing has to be approved by their board in the same fashion that the school district approves the school district's purchasing.
And the code provision that largely exempts them from Title VII does say they still have to meet all the charter's competitive procurement provisions. You can't just do sweetheart deals, but it's all overseen by the board.
And it's not unusual when I get phone calls from ACDA asking advice.
Okay, and then I think the last reason to care about all these things is one that we talked about the most already anyway, which is that they can sometimes be really nimble and helpful in doing innovative things. The ACDA was intimately involved and critical in our acquisition of the headquarters building. I think there's a lot of still untapped potential in the development authority to go out and do good things in the community. That's why it was set up, and we're still interested in infrastructure. So, that was the best I could do in 15 minutes before I
Pretty good.
Good effort. Any questions for Mr. Fuller? Okay, thank you. So that is the last presentation we have for today. Before I gavel us out, Ms. Jones or Ms. Quinn Davidson, what is on the schedule for next month?
For next month, that is your June meeting. The topics that I understood to be the most urgent were, number one, a walkthrough of marijuana licensing. So we're going to actually have a marijuana license AR in front of you, and Mandy is going to walk through. So it's going to be a hands-on, here is what you need to know. And then the second item is also going to be hands-on. It will be Robert's Rules of Jeopardy. So be sure to bring your competitive spirit to that one.
No one here has.
Is that everything?
That's what I remember, but we were trying, maybe some, Mr. Chairman, maybe some feedback, sort of knowing that the topics are somewhat, there is some end in sight, right? I mean, we might not do this forever. I thought maybe it's better to do, instead of 3, do 2 hours, because it just might feel like a lot, especially with work sessions. What do you all think? What makes sense, and how does this feel? Does it feel useful, or what's...
So I can comment before I get to you, Mr. Donovar, on the usefulness. Knowing the topics in advance is helpful because members can then send questions to you or to Ms. Jones so that the administration or whoever's presenting can tailor the presentation to those specific questions. Because it's obvious that we do have questions. Like today, there were a lot of questions on the ACDA and police HQ. And so if we can get those in advance, we can do that. I will let Mr. Dunbar talk about the.
Yeah, I just want to say I did think it was useful. I would support going from 3 hours to 2, particularly because of the existence and proliferations of work sessions.
Yeah, same.
And Mr. Constant,
To add to that, if we are going to create a rules committee
Right.
ongoing structure, that's another hour. And so
Exactly.
it certainly, we don't need 4 hours on the final Friday of the month.
And some days we could do 1 hour training if we want, and then do this committee. So I think we can kind of just see how busy the day looks, if that works for everyone, and try to keep it minimal and just keep plugging away. And maybe each month we can announce what we plan to do next month, so that people will then have time to come up with questions if they have them. I think we already have a plan for July at least, right? We met.
And July, I'm not remembering exactly.
Yeah.
We 2040 land use and rezone. I think those were topics that we thought were pretty important. Same, different format, instead of a PowerPoint, just walking through the rezone. What happens if this happens?
Yeah.
And am I right about that?
Yes, 2040, and then rezone, and we also have plans for August. And I'd also like to interject, we had originally planned for last Fridays, but our June meeting is not the last Friday, it's June 21st, and our July meeting is on the 12th because of assembly meetings and work sessions and all of that, so.
Well, and sometimes,
it's
like,
gonna be monthly.
like this time, the last Friday comes right before a Tuesday that we have a meeting, so we might actually have a lot of work sessions on that day, so it might make sense to do it on the other Friday. So I think we're just sort of playing with the schedule and making sure we don't overload ourselves. And then what other, I had given some feedback to these guys, and we welcome all of your feedback. I know Meg sent in some ideas too. But the retreat, which I think we should call this a training. Retreat sounds like really fun to me, like in a magical place where we're like having wine after dinner and we're getting to know each other, and this is a little different. But I had given some feedback that the retreat we had at the Denina Center, some of there were so many presentations and they were stacked that sometimes it was hard, like particularly with the marijuana thing. I felt like I didn't really absorb, like, what am I doing when I vote to approve something? What am I doing? Like, what exactly am I reviewing? This huge packet or huge chunk of information, like, what should I be looking for? Like, how should I be evaluating it? So that's why they were going to do a sort of example and sort of walk through and actually practice together. So if that kind of stuff is useful for you, let us know. If it's not, let us know as well.
Thank you. Mr. Presbyterian.
Yeah, hopefully I'll stop referring back to the school board at some point as a reference point. But there was a very much of a culture of departments really working hard to prepare these very extensive PowerPoints, right? So they would work very hard and they would put them together and they would come and there would be these very long, in-depth presentations. And we often didn't get that very far in advance. And so it would be it felt like not necessarily the best use of that at that time. So I think this has already been sort of said, but to the degree that in terms of how I learn, for me, getting information in advance, reading that information, having a very brief presentation, sort of just quick overview of it, and then using most of the time for discussion is how I'm going to learn best in terms of the different departments, in terms of our processes and those kinds of things. So, I mean, I think everyone has a different style, but I just wanted to share that being able to read it and then coming and using that time as a dialogue and as a way to sort of dig into the particular parts that I don't understand, or that I need clarification on, or that sort of thing. So, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Constant.
Yeah, thanks. In relationship to the idea of the time, the dates, etc., I would suggest or hope that the Rules Committee picks a day and time that's specific every month, third this, fourth that, and we keep that one targeted and nailed down. And then this other one can be more flexible and even can be needs responsive. It can be more when we have more. But in that way, we get some very consistent work through the process of understanding what everyone's working on.
That sounds
Yeah, thank you. All right, any other questions or thoughts before we close this?
Yes, can I play audience participation?
Sure.
I had a conversation with Ms. LaFrance about reading stuff into the record, and I was asking questions. I think we believe that you don't have to read stuff into the record; that you can just enter it. But have you been able to have that discussion and acted on that changing process so that Ms. LaFrance would not have to be the all-star reader?
I like to think I was an all-star reader too, but we have not had that discussion, so we will have it on Tuesday. Thank you for that
Just for
reminder.
information purposes, Mr. Chairman, when you're in the legislature, you have to ask the speaker for permission to read anything. Otherwise, it's spontaneous.
Thank you.
Which I think is what I think Mr. Falsey has probably said, that you don't have to read it.
Okay, seeing no other questions then, I'll go ahead and close this.